Good evening to you all. Our greetings to our viewers, listeners, and all those who keenly watch our special weekly episode on extremely important subject matter which deals with one of the theme relating to the social and economic justice on a weekly basis. Today, the subject matter upon which we are going to discuss is extremely relevant to the marginalized section of society, that is poverty in the marginalized section of the society. How do we reduce it? How do we reduce the income inequality and the economic inequality as a, as a constitutional values in the constitutional democracy? Tonight, we have one of the renowned scholar as our guest, to whom I'm going to talk on the different aspects of the constitutional justice, economic justice, poverty, and the economic inequality in the marginalized section particularly. So please join me in welcoming Professor Samuel C. Thomson, who is a professor at Penn State Center for the Study of Mergers and Acquisitions. He is one of the distinguished professor of law and the Arthur Weiss Distinguished Faculty Scholar at the Penn State University, Pennsylvania. What to talk about the scholarship and the contribution of Professor Thomson Jr.? He is one of the most beloved professors across the globe in the field of taxation and economic policies. His 2-volume treatise on the business taxation textbooks and the 5-volume treatise entitled as Mergers, Acquisitions, and Tender Offers is considered to be one of the classical and has been relied by the judiciary across the globe, not only in the United States of America. He has authored more than 75 articles on the corporate and international taxations, antitrust, and the securities issues. But the core of the subject matter, which remains very close to his heart, is the improvement of the economic situation of marginalized society. He is taking a special course on how to close the gap between minority and white in the business ownership, the economic inequality, the lawyer's role in helping close the minority white gap in business ownership. Now, I will welcome Professor Samuel C. Thomson formally. Welcome, Professor, to our show.
Thank you so much. It's a delight to be here with you. And the first thing I just want to do, we have a student here at our law school, Abhishek, who is from India, and I've seen him in the hallway many times. I know he works hard in the library, and he's the reason that I'm here today, because I think he brought you to my attention. I understand his father has just been elevated on the Indian Supreme Court, and I just want to congratulate his family for having such a fine son.
Professor, it's always pleasure, and when it comes to from a professor like you, we are indeed proud of being Indian and belonging to that family, connected to that family. And as a professional, Dr. K.S. Chauhan, today he has been designated as Senior Advocate in Supreme Court of India, as you rightly pointed out. So it's very extremely proud and inspirational moment for all of us who belongs to one of the so-called marginalized section of the society in given typical Indian society. So it's a very big achievement for us, and it's a very proud moment for all of us here in India. Thank you, Professor. So, Professor, we will begin our discussion on the subject matter, which is very close to your heart, and as a practitioner of law in Supreme Court of India, it is very close to me also. The subject matter which we have chosen very carefully is poverty in the marginalized section of the society. Professor, in popular perception and understanding, the Constitution as a basic governing document is seen as a legal and political document. Though it also talks about justice, not only social and political, rather than economic also. It has an economic element. It prescribes economic rights. So how do you see constitution of a particular liberal democracy as an economic document? What are your perception and views on that?
Well, first thing, let me say for your listeners that I am not a constitutional scholar. I've never taught a constitutional law course, um, and so I'm just sort of giving you kind of an off the top of the head reaction. And let me start by saying, in the United States, um, I don't think that there's a provision of our Constitution that talks about specifically about economic justice, but I think you can sort of assume, or um, those principles are reflected in several different provisions of our Constitution, and with respect to particularly with respect to Black Americans, the 13th and 14th Amendments to the Constitution of the United States, and the Supreme Court decisions, principally Brown v. Board of Education, which was a 1954 decision that in essence said separate but equal is not equal. And after the Civil War in 1863, after that, well, the war wasn't over until like 1865, even though the Constitution specifically provided for equal treatment of Blacks and whites and any other type of minority within particularly in the southern part of the United States, Virginia and down to Florida, there grew up a system called the Jim Crow system, JIMCROW system, which called for the separation of Blacks and whites, and that separation continued in the South, Virginia and further south, not in the West, in California, for example, but throughout the South from the end of the Civil War until 1954, there was legal segregation under this system of separation of whites and Blacks, which did not come to a legal end until 1954, when the Supreme Court of the United States adopted or found that the separate but equal treatment under the Constitution was inherently unequal and unconstitutional. And as a consequence of that, the segregation of whites and Blacks began to fall. And now, 50 years later, 60 years later, there is, no legal segregation between whites and Blacks, although there is practical segregation between whites and Blacks in the United States. I don't know whether that answered your question, but I wanted to kind of give some context from the perspective of the United States.
Professor, you are talking about the Brown versus Board of Education judgment.
Yes.
Yeah. So, Professor, tell me, you must be at that point, in 1954, you must be very young. Do you have any memories about it?
Ravi, that is a great question, a spectacular question. Because, and one of the things I was going to mention, as a matter of fact, I brought with me. I just saw this morning as I was leaving the house. You see what that says?
Hygienic School for Colored Children.
That's the school that I went to.
Yes.
From the first grade, which started when I was 6 years old, to the sixth grade when I was 12 or 13 years old. That's the school I went to.
Yes.
It was a segregated school, colored children, in
Only
my
for black.
hometown of Steelton, Pennsylvania. Steelton, Steelton, Pennsylvania. So in this Pennsylvania town, and Pennsylvania did not have legal segregation. There was legal segregation. I went to a segregated grade school. Now, what's interesting is in this little hometown, there was segregation at the grade school level, but once you went to high school, there was an integrated high school. And the reason for that is because economically they couldn't have two different high schools, I suppose. Now, notwithstanding that segregation, notwithstanding the hygienic school that I went to, I must say in Pennsylvania, once the Brown v. Board of Education decision came down, they closed this school. They integrated all the schools in Steelton, Pennsylvania, so that while I went to a segregated grade school, my sister and my brother, who are significantly younger than I am, went to, I think my sister went for a year or two here, but my brother missed this altogether. He went to an integrated school. So now that was happening in Pennsylvania, which is not part of the Old South. And
Yes.
in Steelton, Pennsylvania, which is literally 35 miles from Gettysburg. And I don't know whether you've heard of Gettysburg or not, but Gettysburg was the major battle in the Civil War when General Robert E. Lee brought his troops across into Pennsylvania and was going to go to Philadelphia and going to knock out the Union and eliminate this challenge to segregation. Fortunately, the Union whipped and defeated Lee at Gettysburg, and from there on, it was sort of downhill for the South. But the point I'm making is 35 miles from that battle, I was going to a segregated school.
Yes.
100 years later. It's just amazing, I think, in any event, that that happened. But fortunately, 50 years after that, 50, 60 years after that, the school is no longer there. There's no segregation, legal segregation in Steelton, Pennsylvania. However, there continues to be de facto segregation in Steelton.
What, Professor? You are talking about de facto segregation. What are the kinds of de facto segregation which is still existing and prevailing in United States? For example,
That's a very good
if
question. That's a very good question. The de facto segregation comes from the fact that, and again, I'm not an expert in this area. I'm an expert in tax law and
uh,
maybe in
but
corporate law, but I'm not an expert in this area of the law. But let me just say what I think.
yes,
The segregation has been economically based in that blacks in this country, Hispanics in this country. Hispanics are folks who are descendants of um, people from Spain, from Spanish settlers here, and many of them are economically deprived, just like a lot of blacks are economically deprived. But in any event, there's been this system, this economic system, that has caused a lot of black people to live in black neighborhoods because they couldn't afford to buy a house in a white neighborhood. So now, while I can go and buy a house any place I want in the United States, and nobody's going to say, no, we aren't going to accept your money. But the practical matter, as a practical matter, for most Black Americans, for most Hispanic Americans, they are in essence, by de facto segregation, segregated into Black communities. And this has happened, for example, in my little town of Stilton, Pennsylvania. It's
Yeah.
become literally all Black in the past 50 years. One reason, whites didn't want to live in integrated neighborhoods, so they went out and moved out of Stilton. The property values went down, and the folks who could afford those properties were a lot of Black people and brown people. So it's become sort of a Black and brown town. The same for Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is the capital of Pennsylvania. 30 miles from Gettysburg.
Professor, I will just interject here, because what you are talking about, because here in India, we have a fundamental right to receive education. The children have a fundamental right to receive education, and that also free of cost at the state exchequer. Now, we have the schools which are school government funded, and the private schools management is vested with the private hands and the private individuals. Now those schools, the private schools, are also supposed to give 25% of the total seats to the economically weaker section of society. What you are talking about, the discrimination based on based on the economic system. So what as I asked you, that what are the instances of discrimination which is still prevailing here in India? We find that those 25% of students who are admitted in the quota, that is for the economically weaker section of children belonging to the economically weaker section of society, they are being put in one section or one class, and they have different teachers. There even the haircuts get different in those schools, so they can be identified. So though there is a litigation or the cases which are going on before the court, various high courts and Supreme Court in India, that these are the inequality, these are the instances of inequality which is forbidden by the Constitution of India. However, the situation is not improving, and the COVID scenario has brought and infused a different kind of inequality, digital inequality, and that also very dependent upon the economic inequality of the society, because those who can afford the smartphone, laptop and iPads and all those, they were able to get into the classes, online classes of the schools, and those children who belong to the marginalized section of society, they were not. For them, simply the 2-year period has been wasted like this. So what I want to say here, that how do you see this continued marginalization of certain section of society? What are your how do we minimize this gap, and how do we give them a sense of economic security and economic justice to those who belongs to this marginalized section of society, like the Hispanic, so-called economically weaker section of society in United States. In Indian context, the be it scheduled members of scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, or other backward classes, OBC, what we call them in the group, or even the religious minority groups like Muslims and all those whose economic situation is not very well.
Well, I mean, let me give you a quick reaction.
Yes.
As I understand it from just what you said, and I think I've heard this before, is that the Indian Constitution, the Constitution of the country of India, has within it a principle of affirmative action for the disadvantaged. Is that right?
Yes.
The absolute opposite exists in the United States. Well, maybe not the absolute opposite, but in essence, fundamentally, it's the opposite. We have in the United States the kind of within our Constitution the principle of equal protection of the law, and which may not permit certain types of affirmative action. But we do not have, as you have in India, a specific provision in our Constitution says the government shall help minorities. We don't have that in the United States. And there are groups within the United States, conservative groups, principally of whites, who are always pushing the Supreme Court to say, in essence, there's no such thing as affirmative action. All affirmative action is illegal. Now, some may say, well, why isn't that the right answer? Why not treat blacks, whites, American Indians, Hispanics all equally? Forget about affirmative action, which is the opposite of what you're done in India. And there are many Americans who make that argument. Now, I'm not a constitutional guy. I don't sort of think about these issues regularly. But I can tell you why I think that policy is fundamentally unsound for a democracy. And the reason is it locks in most people into the economic strata that they come from, because most people are going to find it very difficult to break out of it. So in the case of blacks, who just 150 years ago were enslaved, and then for another 100 years were subject to Jim Crow, going to the hygienic school, you're locking in for a significant number of people an economic status that is going to be under the economic status of white Americans. So, so this is something I've been thinking about, and I've been thinking about how we as black folks in America and Hispanics in America can fight against this. How we can, what measures we might be able to take to deal with this major hurdle. Now, if we had in 1864, when the Supreme Court, right after the Civil War, if the government had adopted, now listen to this, Robbie, if the government had adopted something that was proposed by General Sherman, who was one of the leading generals of the Union Army, that is the Northern Army that defeated the Southern Army, one of the things he suggested is, because of the discrimination, we should give blacks 20 acres and a mule, 20 acres of land, which is I don't know exactly how big it is, but it's pretty big, and a mule to help farm the land, to give every black who had been enslaved 20 acres and a mule. Now, where would we be if we had followed that policy? There would be much more equality within the United States. But no, America can't do 20 acres and a mule. You're free, but you're free. Go out and make it on your own, man. You're free. Everybody's got to make it on their own in America. So even though you're born with the silver spoon in your mouth and you're born with no spoon in your mouth, many Americans would say, to heck with the difference, you got to make it on your own. And when they say that, what they're in essence doing is marginalizing a whole bunch of people who, no matter what steps they take, are not going to be able to break out of it. So I say, at least in India, you have enshrined in your constitution a principle of affirmative action, a principle of 20 acres and a mule, enshrined in your constitution. But we don't have it enshrined in ours.
Professor, again, a bit of information from Indian perspective. The just after independence and the enactment of new constitution in adoption of new constitution on 26 January 1950, the constitutional history tells us that the India embarked on a major land reform, where the landholders or the jamindars or the land owners, land was a commodity which was uh, owned by very few individuals in India or in the different states of India. So this central government, the union government asked the states to implement the land reforms where the land of the jamindars will be compulsory acquired and it will be distributed in the different segment of the society or the different section of society. Some of the states implemented it very well, and some of the states could not implement it because those accusations by the state got challenged before the Supreme Court, and Supreme Court said that no, Constitution provides for the fundamental right to have a property, and so the land acquisition will fail. And there was a kind of judicial apathy which was not favoring, which was actually favoring the landholders and the original jamindars who were the landowners. So we, after 70 years of this adoption of the constitution, what we see that those states where the land reforms were implemented in India, there the economic inequality is less. There the people from marginalized section of society are very now doing very well, and they have that kind of economic independence, and that brings the social status as well. But in states like Uttar Pradesh, in states like Bihar, in states like West Bengal, these states failed to implement the land reforms, and the marginalized population, particularly a large section of population, still remains a landless laborer class who are dependent on the land, the big landholders and the jamindars, and their continued so-called, I will say, the modern kind of slavery is continued in one or other form. So that brings me to the very peculiar course which you are taking and have designed in the Penn State University, the lawyer's role in helping close the minority white gap in business ownership. Because in modern day scenario, we saw this online businesses flourishing like anything. Amazon, Flipkart, then all these IKEA and all those. So what are the special features and the recommendation of yours, particularly in this course? How do we implement it in India, and for the benefit of our viewers and listeners who can embark upon such journey to be economically independent?
Okay. Can I just comment on your first?
Yes, Professor. Yes.
First point. It seems to me that what you just said is that in India, depending on what state you lived in, there was a 20 acre and a mule granted or not. And in the states where the deprived got 20 acres and a mule, today, 50 years later, there's more equality. among
Yes.
people than
Yes.
there is in those states that did not adopt the 20 acre and a mule. So it's I mean, so what you just said, what I said was that I thought that if right after the Civil War that 20 acre and a mule principle had been adopted, we would have much more equality within our country today than we do. You've just given us an illustration of where not called a 20 acre and a mule, but basically a 20 acre and a mule policy in certain states have led to less inequality in those states today, 50 years later, than there is in states that have did not have a 20 acre and a mule policy. Am I correct in
Yes. You are absolutely correct.
and isn't it interesting how we can be talking here half a world away and we have so much in common when thinking about this problem of inequality. Now, having said that, you asked me a question. Can you re-ask that question and I'll focus on it?
It's about the course which you are taking, and particularly designed to close the economic minority white gap in business ownership, which is which seems to be very interesting. So what are your suggestions and the inputs which the individuals who from the marginalized section of society can take clue and become an economically independent individuals, or they can economically prosper in the given society?
That's a very good question. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about the course.
Yes.
Now, I'm a business lawyer. Um, I grew up as a tax lawyer. I was the head of the tax department at a major law firm in Chicago, and I consider myself to sort of be a tax geek. I mean, I like the corporate tax. I like international tax. I've lived a life of working in those areas. So um, I have worked a lot with capitalists and the like, and business owners, principally white business owners, in helping them to navigate through the Internal Revenue Code, which is what we call our tax system, the Internal Revenue Code. So I've grown up as a tax lawyer and I've loved it. And also in my teaching, I focused on tax initially. I still do tax policy. I still do, but I've moved into the area of mergers and acquisitions, which looks at corporate antitrust, tax aspects of M&A, and a lot of different other aspects of M&A, mergers and acquisition. So I only say that to give you a background of where I'm coming from. All right, I've come to this issue um, after 50, 60 years of being a business lawyer. And I started teaching this course not 20 years ago when I left practice. Well, no, 30 years ago when I left practice and went back into teaching. I left practice in Chicago at my law firm there, Schiff Hardin. I went to UCLA to teach in 1990, January 1, 1990. I moved. I've been out of law practice since, a little bit of consulting here and there, but out of law practice since. So I didn't come to this issue in my law teaching from 1990 to 2021. That's a long time. That's like 40 years. So in 40 years of being in law school teaching, I've been teaching tax and mergers and acquisitions and corporations sometime and antitrust other times. I've been teaching all courses that are central to the regulation of businesses in our country. And also I've looked at international aspects as well, principally from Europe, not rather than from from other countries, but principally from Europe and also from China. Now, I only say that to say where I'm coming from. I'm coming at this from the perspective of a business lawyer, someone who's grew up as a business lawyer in practice and a business lawyer in teaching. So I lay that out as a caveat. Now, why did I come to teach this course, which I first taught in the January semester, January to April semester of this year, and taught again from August to December? Why did I do that? I did it because of some deaths that occurred in the United States where police got caught on camera killing black folks.
Yes.
And I said to myself, hey, you know, I got to try to make a contribution here. And this is a small way of me having an opportunity to make a contribution to dealing with this, putting what I know best, my 50, 60 years of practicing tax law to work and business law to work in dealing with this issue. So now, how did I do it? I organized this course at the law school, Minority Business Development course. And in this course, I followed basically the idea that we followed in my Minority Business Development course in 1970 and 71. So 50 years after taking a Minority Business Development course in law school, I am teaching a Minority Business Development course. 50 years have passed. Now, what I learned once I started teaching this course is that not much has changed in those 50 years. Very little has changed in those 50. In many respects, it's gotten worse in those 50 years. The gaps have grown and not shrunk in those 50 years. So I consider myself fortunate to be back in dealing with that topic that I dealt with as a third-year law student, my last year of law school. And in that course, 50 years ago, I in my thesis, or wasn't it called a dissertation, but my final course paper for the course was a paper that was entitled Minority Business Development, an Analysis and a Proposal. And I went through a huge analysis of where blacks stood on the economic from an economic perspective in the United States, principally blacks at that time, because there weren't many Hispanics in America at that time, at least not in Pennsylvania. So it focused mainly on blacks. So I focused on how do we help to close the gap? I didn't use those terms, but help to close the gap between minority business ownership or black business ownership and white business ownership. And I did the analysis. And one of the things I said in that paper, which happened to be published, it was my first publication. It was published in 4 issues of something called the Black Business Digest, which is no longer published. But one of the things I said in that article, in 1971, one of the things I said was that the gap is so wide, it may never be closed. And as I started to think about things in 2021, literally 50 years ago, when I got back into this area, I said, damn, this gap is huge. And so I went back and I read my thesis and I said, damn, I said that 50 years ago. And over 50 years, there has been, in essence, zero progress in closing that gap. Zero progress in closing that gap. And it is to be expected. It is to be expected because go back to the end of the Civil War. You free a whole bunch of black folks and you give them nothing for all the work that they and their parents have done. And you say you're free. Make it on your own, man. Make it on your own. And they're starting on the economic ladder way back. Way back. And as a consequence, as any economist would tell you, having capital allows you to grow capital. When you don't have any capital, it's difficult to grow. So it's not surprising that the gap has grown in our country. Now, fortunately, I would say in your country, you have enshrined in your constitution the concept of affirmative action in order to eliminate economic disparities. And I would think, and I'm sure this is the case, that lawyers in India are pushing to have the government adopt policies that are consistent with what's stated in the Constitution. Now, I realize I'm going on a little bit, but I want one thing I wanted to say, because you asked me about, well, what is the solution? And in
Yes.
my class, I focused on the first 5 sessions. The first 5 weeks, we focus on understanding the problem. The next 8 sessions, we focus on the lawyer's tools in helping to solve the problem. That part of the course could be taught to any business lawyer. It deals with taxation, it deals with corporate, it deals with securities laws, it deals with, in the United States, intellectual property law, it deals with joint ventures, it deals with stuff that's important for any business lawyer. So 5 weeks of trying to understand what our problem is in the gap in business ownership, 8 weeks of the tools that any lawyer needs in helping to deal with that gap. And then finally, we have a wrap-up session that went on for 4 hours that where I had experts from around the country talk about this issue. And I made a presentation at this session. The last session of it,
Yeah.
I made a presentation. We had several people to comment, and I have a proposal that is based on what I proposed back in 1971. Proposal for helping to close the gap here in the United States. And let me tell you what this proposal is.
Yes.
In the United States, the most segregated time of the week is Sunday morning, which is the time you go to church.
Church.
Now, most people in the United States are Christian, and most Black Americans are members of a Christian church. And most of these churches are in segregated neighborhoods. So they're either in segregated neighborhoods or they are segregated on Sunday morning. Sunday morning is when you go to Christian church generally. It's the most segregated time in America. Sunday morning. In my hometown of Stilton, Pennsylvania, 12,000 people, about 4,000 Blacks. We had 3 churches. 3 churches. My church, Mount Zion Baptist Church, happened to be right next to the one bank and across the street from the other bank in Stilton, Pennsylvania, across the street from the post office. So it was not in a segregated area, but on Sunday morning it was segregated because there were no white people in my church. There were only Black people in my church. And this is true throughout the country. In Stilton, Pennsylvania, there were 2 other large Black churches where Black folks went on Sunday morning. And in walking to my church, I had to walk past a large white church. I don't even remember what denomination it is. I think it may have been Methodist. The idea of me going in that white church was something that never even occurred to me. because, hey, blacks go to black churches, whites go to white churches. So for folks who grew up and purport to be living their lives in accordance with the principles that Jesus Christ taught us, you know, on Sunday morning when we're celebrating Jesus Christ, we got to do it in a separate way,
in a separate
in
way and separate manner and separate place.
separate place. Now, here's the point that I make in my class, and I made in my last class, and talked with that I had several experts who were responding to it, and they said it might be something that would work. So let me just outline it for you. These black churches are in black communities throughout the United States. You go to any black community in the United States, you're going to find a church. You're going to find people going to church on Sunday morning. And I see this as a real opportunity to help close the economic wealth gap. Now, how is that? How do you use churches to do this? And I proposed this in my article in done in as my thesis in my third year of law school in 1971. I came back to it this year. How do you do it? You bring these churches together to form what I call the National Development Corporation and the National Development Bank. You raise cash from the parishioners, from the members of the churches. You bring them all together to develop a large industrial corp and a large bank that have as their goals two things: make a profit and help a minority, help blacks, help other minorities to get ahead. And the churches would own the Class A stock, the voting stock that controlled the entity, so that it would be always in the hands of black institutions. But any institution could buy stock in these companies. And in America, a lot of white folks would be more than happy to buy stock in these companies. And I'm sure a lot of white churches would be willing to buy stock in the company. And a lot of guys like myself, Sam Thmopsun, would be buying stock in those companies. And other folks who aren't black but consider this an important issue would be buying stock. So it would allow us to develop a pool of capital to go forward, hopefully, in attacking this problem. So it's not a panacea, it's not a silver bullet, but I think it is something that could help. And I come to this conclusion after first proposing it 50 years ago, but after teaching my class here at Penn State Law for the past 2 semesters, I've come to think that it may be a good idea. And the group of folks who were there and on the panel critiquing my proposal were also of that view. I don't know whether they were just saying it in order to pat me on the back, but they did say, hey, they thought that it made some sense.
Professor, before we wind up, one last question, which is there in my mind, because you have been very instrumental in designing the tax policies of a diverse country like South Africa. So, how do you see the design of this economic and taxation policy vis-a-vis diversity, considering the particularly the religious diversity, the ethnic diversity, and the different section of the society in constitutional democracies like South Africa, India, or the United States, whether those whether the economic policy of these democracies, which has such a wide diversity, should have a kind of subsidy towards the health, education, and other basic social entitlements of the marginalized section of society? Or do you believe in free economy, or that the yes, you are free to create the wealth and keep and grow, which the particularly United States Constitution affirms and is based upon?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned South Africa because I had a um, the opportunity to work in South Africa as the tax policy advisor to the Ministry of Finance there back in 1994, a long time ago.
Yes.
By the way, at the time, and I worked with not only the Ministry of Finance, but I worked with SARS, the South African Revenue Service. And
At that point of time, the South African Constituent Assembly was National Assembly was framing its constitution, was debating its new constitution of
no,
19.
when I was there, the Constitution had already been developed. The new Constitution. It was the last. It was the last year of Nelson Mandela's presidency. When I
National Mandate.
Yeah, but one of the things that to mention to you, in South Africa, there's a large Indian population,
Oh,
and the at the time the gentleman I worked with and worked for at the South African Revenue Service was a gentleman named Praveen Gorham, who was of Indian descent. And he subsequently went on to become the minister of finance, the head of the finance department
South.
in the South African government. So I just say that to say it was. I have not been to India, but I've had the opportunity to work closely with a person who is who's a descendant of India in South Africa. But I'm glad you mentioned South Africa. I'm glad you mentioned South Africa because one of the things that I am most proud of is the tax policy work I was able to do in South Africa. And I don't want to. I mean, I'm not patting myself on the back. I'm just trying to state a fact.
It's your contribution which is being recognized, and as I did this background research about you, yeah, it's something which you contributed, and it is being acknowledged worldwide.
Well, let me tell you what it is basically. In
Yes.
South Africa, they did not have, and I don't know whether they've changed it or not, but when I got there, they did not have a taxation of capital gains. So if someone bought stock and sold stock at a gain, there was no tax. It was tax free. One
Yes.
of the arguments I made was this is crazy to give because the main people who were realizing capital gains were rich white folks. So
Yeah,
why
and
would you why would you
getting a
why would they've already had a huge advantage? Why would you give them this advantage in the tax system? And the minister of finance there um, decided, hey, we're going to change that, and they changed it. Now I don't know whether it's going back or not, but because I haven't followed it. But also because I was a tax guy and because I knew a lot about the tax system, another thing I proposed is that they should have what's known as a worldwide system of taxing foreign income. So if a South African business sets up a company in India, then the income earned in India should be subject to South African tax after giving a credit for any tax paid in India. It's called a worldwide system of taxation. And I so I argued for that. And the Minister of Finance said, yeah, it makes sense. We're going to do it, notwithstanding the objection of a whole bunch of folks in the South African Ministry of Finance. Now, I don't know whether they kept that system or not. I think it's the right system to use. And in the United States, we have versions of it, but we also go in the other direction of saying a certain amount of foreign income earned by U.S. corporations is not subject to U.S. tax. But some of it is. And in my judgment, all of it should be subject to this credit for any foreign tax paid. So fortunately, at the time, South Africa adopted this system that the only guy in the Ministry of Finance who was suggesting it was myself. And fortunately, the Minister of Finance said, hey, this makes some sense. So this is maybe the most rewarding thing I've done in my life, is to have had the opportunity to work with the Ministry of Finance in South Africa.
Thank you, Professor. We will wind up here for the presentation today. And I extend my welcome, and we expect that you will be very soon visiting us in India, and we look forward to welcome you here in New Delhi. And please do visit New Delhi. India is such a diverse country. India is such a great country, emerging economy, which needs at least not on the professional front, but at least on a personal capacity. I invite you to the New Delhi, and please visit us. We have amazing culture, amazing social structure, and particularly the body politic. The body politic, particularly we the people, who defines the India, and it's the element today, is perhaps the largest democracy on the earth, with such a huge population, with such a huge diversity. And the Constitution of India binds us together, and the government, and particularly which carries as per the Constitution, we the people of India defines it. So it was pleasure talking to you, Professor, on such an important topic which deals with the economic justice, and particularly the poverty in the marginalized section of the society. We have gained a lot from your experience of the South Africa, typical United States society, and the experience of not only a decade or 2 decades, the experience of 70 years, around 70 years.
78 years. Don't cheat me, man. 78 years.
78 years. Because when you mentioned the celebrated judgment of 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, and as rightly you pointed out, that those were the time when you were going to schools, and you went to a segregated school. And so the journey has been so exciting and so rewarding, and particularly your experience, we could not, the 1 hour time is very less for us. However, we look forward to have you again on the show at any mutually convenient date. Thank you for this lovely.
Ravi, would you just give me 1 minute?
Yes.
I want this young man to come and say hello to his parents. Abhishek, come over here and say hello to your parents. Let them know where you are.
Hello, hello, Papa, hello, Mama. I'm at Professor Sam Thmopsun's office right now, and I really thank him for joining us today. Thank you, sir.
You have a great son. I know he works very, very hard. I see him in the library all the time, and you can be very proud of him. And I want to thank him so much for the introduction today. Thank you.
Thank you so
Okay.
much.
Okay, Ravi, are we done?
Yes, Professor. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And really appreciate it. Bye-bye.
It's my pleasure.